Alright guys, we're back staring at my engine bay, and in this video we're going to talk about B58 maintenance. So of course this is a really common question because a lot of you want to know what maintenance you should be doing just to make sure that your car lasts as long as possible, or maybe you're getting ready to tune your car, upgrade your turbo, and you want to know what maintenance you should do in advance to make sure that it goes as smoothly as possible. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So probably the most common question I get is what you should do before tuning your car. And this typically comes from people that might have had other BMWs or maybe other platforms where you have to get, colder spark plugs and all of these different things just to simply make your car work with a tune. And in our case, you actually don't need to do any of that. A lot of the stuff on our car is actually really robust and it works really well when you're tuning your car or even pushing, pretty good amounts of power. So there's nothing that you necessarily need to do just because you're adding power to your car. What I do recommend is making sure that you're up to date on your maintenance. So just keep up with all of your oil and filter changes and make sure that all of it is done on time. And that way you'll have the best reliability possible as you continue to upgrade your car. Now, as far as what your regular maintenance intervals are, there is this really crazy relic that I found inside of my car. I know a lot of people haven't seen this before, but it's actually called an owner's manual. And this is one of those cool things that it comes with the car, it sits in your glove box and nobody ever touches it, and somehow it always disappears. So I'm holding on to mine. I highly anticipate that this will go up in value one day, but one of the booklets in here is specifically marked maintenance. So when you open up this booklet, you can actually see all of the different maintenance intervals that BMW recommends. So down here you have majority of the oil and fluid changes that are needed for our cars, and everything that BMW bases their recommendations on is their yearly service. So once a year or once every about 10,000 miles, you're supposed to bring your car to the dealership and they do whatever service is needed based on that interval. Now, some of these don't match the recommendations from the actual manufacturer of the fluids or the filters or, whatever you're doing maintenance on. So I like to look at both options and go with the one that has the shortest interval. And I just feel like that gives me the best opportunity to get the best reliability out of our cars. So the first service is for oil, and that's one that you do every year or every 10,000 miles. This is one that I follow pretty much to the book. I change my oil once a year, but I only drive about 6,000 miles a year. So it's not as critical for me to worry about it because I know the mileage is really low. If you're getting closer to 10,000 plus miles a year, my recommendation is to send your oil out for an analysis. Make sure that they are indicating that your service intervals are good. And if everything looks good, then you can continue doing what you're doing. But they will give you a good idea of whether you actually need to reduce that interval and change your oil more frequently. And that can be due to a lot of different factors. Most people assume that tuning your car means that you need to change your oil more often. And I would say that's not the case, especially in our cars. The OEM oil is designed for our engine, and as long as your engine is stock and you haven't upgraded the internals or changed any bearings or anything, you should be okay to stick with the OEM oil and the OEM intervals. The only thing that I do say or recommend reducing your intervals for is if you're running extremely high ethanol content, because that ethanol will contaminate your oil, and over time it'll begin to dilute it and reduce its properties. So even when I was running full E85, I changed my oil around 6,000 miles and they said that there were no issues. The actual fuel dilution was pretty low, but depending on your driving style and things like that, that might be different. So again, if you're going to be running, high ethanol content, full E85 or whatever, send your oil out for analysis. Make sure that your oil change interval is good enough, and that'll give you the confidence you need to continue with your maintenance plan. Now, your next maintenance item is your air filter, and if you have a stock air filter, you're supposed to change it every 4 years or 4,000 miles or every fourth oil change. So you can do that pretty rarely. It's not something that's as critical on our cars simply because the air filter is really high quality, flows a lot of air. It's also really cheap though, so if you want to change it more often than that, you can. But I've taken off my air filter multiple times before I upgraded my car, and it showed no signs of any excessive dirt or anything. So I definitely see those lasting at least that long. Now, if you have an aftermarket intake, you might be able to just clean and oil the filter. So you can do that based on the recommendation from whoever you bought your intake from. Some people also just prefer to replace the whole filter because if you put too much oil on it or if you don't clean it properly, you might cause other issues. So again, just kind of follow the plan that came from the company you bought it from and do whatever you're most comfortable with. Next, we're going to talk about spark plugs, and I have a whole video talking about all the different options for plugs and why our stock plugs are more than adequate for most people's goals. So you can check that out if you want to see more information than you probably need. But long story short, the spark plug interval on our cars is 60,000 miles or 6 years. And if you look at the manufacturer's recommendations, they actually rate the plugs for 100,000 miles. So I'd say 60,000 is pretty conservative. I know some people do it at 40,000 miles as well. But if you're experiencing misfires or any other issues that are caused by your spark plugs, that's the best indicator that you either need to replace them or reduce your maintenance interval. So I know some people, like I said, have reduced it to like 30 to 40,000 miles because they're running really high boost pressure and stuff that just puts a lot of wear on the plugs. And if you leave them at stock gap, that wear will actually increase the gap even more and cause it to start to misfire. So that's something that you just want to pay attention to. And if it's worn down, replace it. Now, the rest of the drivetrain kind of is weird from BMW. If you look at some of the M models, they have services for differentials and transmissions and things like that, but our cars do not. The ZF 8-speed and basically our whole drivetrain is just rated for lifetime fluids with no need to replace. Now, if you actually go to the manufacturer, like if you go to ZF, they will recommend replacing the transmission fluid every 100,000 kilometers or 8 years. And 100,000 kilometers is about 60,000 miles. So basically at the same time that you would replace your spark plugs, it's probably a good time to replace the fluids in your differential, your transmission, if you have one, replacing your transfer case as well. And for all of those, I typically just recommend OEM or OEM rated fluids. So I don't really see upgrades super necessary. I know some people have changed some fluids to help it handle heat better and things like that. And there are going to be a lot of different options on the market to test out. So usually I just like sticking with stock because I know that the OEM fluid has all the additives and properties you need to keep the transmission and rest of your drivetrain happy. Now, besides that, you can do like the whole 100-point inspection, like what BMW does. Basically just go through your car and check for any wearables and consumables so that you know if something needs to be replaced. So go check out your brake discs and your brake pads. Those have minimum thicknesses, so if it goes below that minimum thickness, it's time to either replace your rotors or your pads. Check your coolant levels. Do that every single oil change, more often if you can. It's something that's easy enough to do, and if you have a low coolant level, that can cause a lot of issues. So every once in a while, just open up the cap and check to make sure your fluids are good. Also, you can go underneath these covers and check your brake fluid. I actually have a tool that I put inside there and it checks for like contamination and water inside the brake fluid, so it tells you when it's time to replace it. Also, just make sure that the fluid is topped off because if it gets low, same thing, it'll cause a lot of issues. And even other things like your battery can be checked, your tires, of course, you should be staying on top of that. So for all of those things, you want to make sure that they're basically up in good quality. So whatever upgrades you do on your car will go as smoothly as possible, especially the battery, because that can cause a lot of issues when you're trying to flash your car. If you don't have a charger, you definitely don't want the battery to die. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up for my recommendations. Again, I keep it pretty simple because I know that the car in stock form with OEM components works really well, and I try not to mess with something that isn't broken. Do your own due diligence, send out your fluids for testing, and keep an eye on your consumables so that you know if something needs to be replaced, because just because one thing works for me doesn't mean it'll work perfectly for you, and you have all the tools you need to develop your own maintenance plan. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.